What if the promise of a utopia turned into a nightmare? The Soviet Union began with grand ambitions of equality and power. But from mass purges to famines, millions paid the price. Can a revolution really claim to serve the people when it's built on so much suffering? By the early 20th century, Imperial Russia, a sprawling empire covering 1/6 of the Earth's surface, appeared to be a stronghold of unshakable czarist power. But beneath this illusion of control, cracks in its foundation were widening. Tsar Nicholas II, the autocratic ruler of this vast empire, held absolute power over a diverse population of peasants, industrial workers, and ethnic minorities. The gulf between his insulated life in the Winter Palace and the harsh realities faced by the majority of his subjects grew dangerously wide. Anywhere from 80 to 85% of the population lived in poverty, scraping by on subsistence farming and limited industrial wages. At the same time, political reform movements were bubbling just beneath the surface, pressured by the lack of civil liberties, land reforms, and a government virtually frozen in time. The Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 was one of the first major blows to the aging empire. It was meant to assert Russia's power and expand its influence in East Asia, but the conflict instead ended in a humiliating defeat. Japan's superior naval capabilities and modern military shocked the world, but the loss hit Russia even harder. The defeat exposed outdated military structures and failures in leadership, tarnishing the prestige of the Romanov dynasty. More importantly, the war drained resources and further alienated the struggling population. Soldiers returned home to poverty-stricken families, while labor strikes surged in major cities. Citizens began asking, if the regime couldn't win a war, could it protect its people? This discontent boiled over in 1905, during a nationwide revolution, sparked by the infamous Bloody Sunday massacre. On January 22nd, peaceful protesters marching toward the Winter Palace to present a petition to the Tsar were met with brutal force as soldiers opened fire, killing hundreds. The event shattered the myth that Nicholas II could be a benevolent father to his people. What followed was a chaotic year of strikes, peasant uprisings, and worker-led demonstrations demanding better working conditions, land redistribution, and political representation. Facing mounting pressure, Nicholas reluctantly established the Duma, a legislative body, in an attempt to appease reformists. But this was a hollow concession. The Duma's power was strictly limited, and the key decisions remained firmly in the hands of the Tsar, leaving the revolutionary movements unsatisfied. Then came World War I, a conflict that would deal a near-fatal blow to the already faltering empire. Russia's military suffered catastrophic losses due to poor training, faulty logistics, and outdated equipment. On the home front, food shortages became unbearable as resources were redirected to the war effort. Railway systems failed, leaving cities cut off from vital supplies. Frustrations mounted into open outrage as soldiers mutinied and civilians rioted for bread. Meanwhile, public suspicion of the royal family intensified due to the growing influence of Tsarina Alexandra and her confidant, the mystic Rasputin. The Tsarina's German roots alienated her from a war-weary population, while Rasputin's bizarre involvement in state affairs enraged the nobility and military alike. In a desperate bid to salvage his authority, Nicholas II left Petrograd for the front lines to personally oversee military operations. But the gesture backfired. His absence made him directly associated with the army's failures, while leaving the capital politically adrift. Day-to-day governance fell into chaos, with Tsarina Alexandra and Rasputin making erratic decisions that further undermined the regime's credibility. By the beginning of 1917, the empire teetered on the edge of collapse. The tipping point came in March 1917. Petrograd, the imperial capital, became the epicenter of strikes and mass protests as workers and soldiers refused to follow orders. Factories shut down, transport ground to a halt, and even the loyal Cossacks abandoned their posts. When it became clear that neither the military nor the Duma would intervene to rescue his regime, Nicholas II abdicated the throne on March 15th, ending over 300 years of Romanov rule. The old world was gone, but the new world was anything but stable. In a fittingly bizarre twist, the empire's doom had a symbolic precursor: Grigory Rasputin's assassination in late 1916. Conspirators poisoned his food with cyanide, shot him repeatedly, and eventually resorted to drowning him after he refused to die. In many ways, Rasputin's inexplicable survival mirrored the stubborn resilience of the old regime, until both, at last, sank under the weight of their own contradictions. The February Revolution of 1917, which actually began in March due to Russia still using the Julian calendar, erupted from a storm of anger, hunger, and exhaustion. Petrograd was at the heart of the upheaval. Bread riots and worker strikes gripped the city, paralyzing its factories and streets. Ordinary soldiers, tasked with controlling the chaos, eventually joined the protests instead, hoisting red flags alongside the crowds. Tsar Nicholas II, isolated and unaware of the scale of unrest, ordered troops to crack down. But by the time he realized even his military had turned against him, it was too late. On March 15th, in a rail car far from the capital, the Tsar signed his abdication, ending centuries of Romanov rule. In the immediate power vacuum, the provisional government was hastily formed by elites from the Duma, Russia's short-lived parliament. Many of its leaders were liberal in ideology and sought to democratize the country by easing censorship, promising eventual elections, and introducing civil freedoms. They preached stability through progression, arguing Russia could evolve into a functioning democracy. However, this government was extremely cautious, refusing to push through radical reforms to avoid alienating the powerful land-owning class. At the same time, it shocked many by declaring its intention to stay in the disastrous war effort, motivated by foreign loans and a fear of abandoning alliances. Parallel to the provisional government's formal operations rose a far more organic movement: Soviets. These grassroots councils, made up largely of workers and soldiers, acted as both a counterweight and a challenger to official leadership. The Petrograd Soviet, in particular, became incredibly influential, representing the voices of those most disenfranchised by Russia's broken system. Leaders in the Petrograd Soviet often clashed with those in the provisional government, and a state of dual power quickly emerged. While the provisional government promised democracy from above, the Soviets demanded immediate, concrete solutions from below. This dual power structure proved untenable. Furious peasants wanted land redistribution, soldiers longed for an end to the war, and workers demanded better conditions. And the provisional government seemed no closer to delivering any of these things. Into this growing void of desperation stepped an exiled revolutionary with a clear vision for change: Vladimir Lenin. With the war raging in Western Europe, Germany seized an opportunity to destabilize its Russian enemy. On April 3rd, they sent Lenin back to Petrograd in a sealed train, seeing him as a destabilizing agent who would weaken the provisional government. Lenin wasted no time. He stunned allies and enemies alike with the radical demands outlined in his April theses: immediate withdrawal from the war, redistribution of land to peasants, and for all power to shift to Soviets. His motto, peace, land, and bread, caught fire with those exhausted by endless promises and no action. To the provisional government, Lenin and the Bolsheviks, the faction he led, became a growing threat as their ideas spread among workers and peasants. By summer, unrest intensified. In what became known as the July Days, spontaneous protests erupted across Petrograd, demanding the provisional government's overthrow. The effort failed, and the provisional government doubled down, using loyal Cossacks and officers to crush rioters. Lenin fled to Finland, temporarily defeating the Bolsheviks' strategic advance. Still, support for the Bolsheviks grew, as they seemed to be the only group offering a radical, immediate escape from Russia's crisis. By October, the Bolsheviks, now dominant in Soviets around Petrograd, moved decisively. Trotsky, another key Bolshevik leader, managed to intricate plans for a coup. On October 25th, November 7th under the Gregorian calendar, Bolshevik forces entered the Winter Palace, where the provisional government had barricaded itself. Resistance was minimal, and the palace was seized with almost no bloodshed. The Bolsheviks declared victory, securing power under the name of the Soviets they claimed to serve. Lenin's dramatic ascent was no coincidence. His calculated planning, combined with perfect timing, allowed him to exploit a system on the brink of collapse. However, the shockwaves of his rise reverberated far beyond Petrograd. It marked the dawn of one of the 20th century's most transformative regimes. After the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks may have seized control of Petrograd, but their hold on the rest of Russia was far from secure. Almost immediately, they faced resistance from a coalition of groups with little in common beyond their shared opposition to the Bolsheviks. This loose alliance, known as the White Army, included monarchists yearning for the return of the Tsar, liberal reformers advocating for democracy, and other factions disillusioned by the Bolshevik ideology. Adding to this chaotic mix were foreign powers, Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, all of whom feared the spread of communism and secretly or openly supported the anti-Bolshevik forces. On the Bolshevik side was the newly created Red Army, organized under the leadership of Leon Trotsky. A gifted orator and strategist, Trotsky transformed a small disorganized force into a disciplined and motivated fighting machine. The introduction of political commissars ensured loyalty by embedding ideologically committed officers throughout the ranks. Conscription brought millions of soldiers under Bolshevik command, while deserters faced harsh punishment, often execution. Despite their ideological commitment, the Red Army's tactics were often brutal, resorting to widespread repression in areas where they struggled to maintain control. The Russian Civil War, which raged from 1918 to 1922, was not a single linear conflict, but a fragmented struggle with shifting alliances and multiple rival factions. While the Bolsheviks controlled the industrial heartlands and transportation hubs of Central Russia, the Whites operated on the fringes of the empire. This geographical disadvantage left the Whites disconnected and disunited, with competing leaders and conflicting goals undermining their ability to mount a cohesive campaign. The war saw atrocities committed by both sides. Mass executions, looting, and the targeting of civilians became horrifyingly common. Foreign intervention briefly tipped the scales in favor of the anti-Bolshevik forces. Allied countries sent troops, weapons, and supplies to the Whites, aligning with their desire to suffocate the Bolshevik Revolution before it could spread. However, these interventions were inconsistent and lacked coordination. Western powers were still reeling from World War I, and their inability or unwillingness to fully commit meant their involvement did little to influence the war's outcome. For example, American troops landed in Siberia and northern Russia, but avoided significant battles, while French forces quickly withdrew from southern Russia after sustaining losses. The foreign interventions managed to inflame Russian nationalist sentiment, ironically strengthening the Bolsheviks' position. At the core of the Bolshevik strategy was their control over central Russia. This gave them access to vital resources, factories, and railways, ensuring that their troops could move supplies and reinforcements far more efficiently than the scattered white forces. Just as importantly, Bolshevik propaganda played a critical role, framing their cause as one fighting for the workers and peasants against foreign intervention and the return of oppressive czarist rule. They promised land redistribution, peace, and an end to the old social order. While they couldn't always deliver on these promises, the message resonated deeply with those who had suffered under previous regimes. By 1920, the Reds had managed to defeat white forces in most regions, solidifying their control through a series of relentless military campaigns. They reclaimed areas previously lost to separatist movements and crushed peasant uprisings that challenged their authority. In some cases, their methods resembled those they had condemned in others. Brutal repression was justified as a necessary part of the revolutionary struggle. One of the most dramatic examples of their ruthlessness came in 1918, when the Bolsheviks ordered the execution of Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their children, and several loyal retainers. Beyond eliminating the possibility of Nicholas becoming a rallying figure for the whites, this act symbolically severed Russia from its imperial past. Both the decision and its secrecy haunted Russian history well into the 20th century, with the burial site only officially confirmed decades later. By 1922, the Bolsheviks had emerged from the chaos of the Russian Civil War as the uncontested rulers of what had once been the vast Russian Empire. Their victory wasn't achieved through military strength alone. It also depended on their ability to impose control over diverse territories, each with its own political ambitions and cultural differences. Neighboring areas like Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasus, modern-day Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan were significant battlegrounds for the Bolsheviks. These regions offered critical resources and strategic advantages, but many local populations resisted Bolshevik domination. The Red Army swept through these territories, crushing independence movements and ensuring that the central government in Moscow would face no real local opposition. Alongside military campaigns, the Bolsheviks used political repression and negotiated compromises, temporarily allowing some local elites to retain power to gain their allegiance. On December 30th, 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, was formally established, initially including 4 republics: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Socialist Federative Soviet Republic. On paper, these republics seemed to represent a cooperative federation of equal partners, united under shared socialist goals. In reality, the USSR was anything but an equal union. While republics were allowed certain cultural freedoms, decision-making power was almost entirely concentrated in Moscow. Local leaders were expected to adhere strictly to the policies set by the Bolshevik-dominated Communist Party, leaving little room for actual self-governance. The central government used any means necessary, whether through persuasion, administrative control, or outright violence, to ensure that the Union was not just maintained, but tightly controlled. This new state drew its ideological foundation from Marxism-Leninism, a doctrine that promised to create a classless and stateless society. However, in its earliest years, the Soviet Union looked less like a utopia and more like a heavily centralized one-party state, wrapped in the language of socialism. The 1924 Soviet Constitution cemented the dominance of the Communist Party, which operated as the ultimate authority in political, economic, and social life. Institutions like the Cheka, the Soviet secret police, maintained strict surveillance and rooted out any perceived dissidents. Those who openly opposed or even questioned Bolshevik policies often faced arrest, execution, or exile. For the hundreds of ethnic and national minorities within the USSR's borders, the promises of equality and self-determination were particularly complicated. The Soviet government initially encouraged cultural expression, creating schools and media in local languages as part of its Korenizatsiya, or indigenization policies. These programs were seen as a way to gain the trust of minority groups, while eroding the influence of traditional nationalist movements. But as Soviet rule tightened, so did control over these diverse groups. Russification, the promotion of Russian culture and language as dominant, slowly took precedence, particularly for those regions perceived as less loyal to Moscow. Movements for independence were stamped out with increasing severity, and attempts at defiance could result in mass reprisals, deportations, or executions. The creation of the Soviet Union had ripple effects beyond its borders. It marked the birth of the world's first communist state, a revolutionary experiment that quickly positioned itself as an antagonist to the capitalist world order. Western nations, already wary after the Bolsheviks withdrew from World War I and called for global revolution, viewed the creation of the USSR as an ideological and strategic threat. The USSR's founding also inspired leftist movements across the globe, offering a model, however flawed, of what they believed a socialist state might achieve. Although the USSR projected itself as a partnership of equals, its true nature was one of centralized power, enforced unity, and ultimately suppression of dissent. Even its most recognizable symbols reflected this duality. The hammer and sickle emblem, meant to represent unity between workers and peasants, became a potent icon of both hope and fear worldwide. The acronym CCCP, written in the Cyrillic alphabet, became instantly recognizable, even though most outside the Soviet Union struggled to pronounce it. This stark mix of ideals and authoritarianism made the Soviet Union not only a geopolitical force, but also a symbol of grand promises, the fulfillment of which came with devastating human costs. When the Russian Civil War ended in 1922, the country lay in absolute devastation. Industry had collapsed, millions were dead, and famine ravaged the countryside. Entire communities vanished as starvation hit unprecedented levels, and rural rebellion simmered just beneath the surface. Lenin and his government faced an enormous dilemma: how to rebuild a nation on the brink of collapse while maintaining the socialist ideals of the revolution. The brutal policies of war communism during the Civil War, seizing grain from peasants, nationalizing industries, and banning private trade, had kept the Red Army supplied but destroyed what little remained of the peasant economy. Rebellion among farmers and workers was on the rise, and a new civil conflict seemed dangerously close. Lenin responded with a measure that shocked even some of his own supporters. In 1921, he introduced the New Economic Policy, or NEP, which marked a dramatic retreat from full socialist principles in favor of pragmatism. Under the NEP, peasants were allowed to sell surplus goods on the open market, small businesses could operate privately, and private trade was legalized. At the same time, the state maintained control over heavy industry, transportation, banking, and foreign trade. Lenin described the NEP as a temporary concession to capitalism, intended to stabilize the economy and prevent further uprisings. This hybrid system was not the ideal of communist theory, but it offered a lifeline to a starving and angry population. The results were immediate. Agricultural production rebounded as peasants were finally incentivized to produce more food. Markets reopened and supplies of grain reached urban centers, alleviating famine and calming unrest. Small-scale entrepreneurs, or netmen, began to revive local economies by trading goods and services. While critics derided these traders as symbols of capitalism creeping back into the system, their economic impact was undeniable. Workers returned to factories stabilized under state control, and towns began to recover from years of destruction. For the first time in years, life in many parts of Russia seemed to improve, however marginally. Politically, though, Lenin's government showed no signs of softening. While the economy opened up, the one-party state tightened its grip. Dissent, even from former allies, was not tolerated. A stark example was the Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921. Just outside Petrograd, sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, once fervent supporters of the Bolsheviks, staged an uprising, demanding greater freedoms, better working conditions, and an end to Bolshevik authoritarianism. Calling the rebels counter-revolutionaries, even though many shared socialist ideals, Lenin sent the Red Army to crush the uprising. The assault was brutal and decisive, leaving over 1,000 dead and thousands more imprisoned. The rebellion's suppression sent an unambiguous message. Opposition to the party would not be brooked, no matter its origins. As the NEP restored relative stability, Lenin's health began to deteriorate. His first stroke in 1922 left him weak, and a second in 1923 effectively ended his political career. In his final writings, Lenin expressed concern about the growing concentration of power in the hands of certain figures, particularly Joseph Stalin, whom he described as rude and unfit for leadership. However, Lenin died in January 1924, before he could act on his warnings. His death left a power vacuum at the top of the Communist Party, triggering a fierce struggle between prominent leaders like Trotsky, Bukharin, and Stalin. Lenin's death was marked by an astonishing act of propaganda. Against his own wishes for a simple burial, Soviet leaders embalmed his body and placed it in a specially constructed mausoleum in Red Square. His carefully preserved corpse was put on public display, transforming him into an eternal symbol of both revolutionary ideals and party doctrine. To this day, Lenin's body remains a chilling relic of Soviet history, seen by many as a physical embodiment of the revolution's triumphs and its contradictions. After Lenin's death in January 1924, the future of the Soviet Union hinged on a brutal fight for power. The Bolshevik Party had no clear system for succession, and Lenin's rise to almost mythical status made the stakes uncommonly high. At the heart of the struggle stood leading Bolsheviks like Leon Trotsky, Grigory Zinoviev, Lev Kamenev, and an emerging Joseph Stalin. Trotsky, a commanding figure known for his intellect and role in the Civil War, seemed the obvious candidate to many. He was fiery, charismatic, and widely respected, but also divisive. In contrast, Stalin presented an image of simplicity and pragmatism, though few realized the plans he was quietly setting in motion. As General Secretary of the Communist Party, Stalin held a position that seemed insignificant at first glance. However, this role came with extensive administrative control, allowing him to appoint allies to key positions in the party's sprawling bureaucracy. Unnoticed by many at the time, Stalin was building a loyal network within the very structure of government itself. While he lacked Trotsky's revolutionary glamour, Stalin excelled at behind-the-scenes maneuvering. He also skillfully positioned himself as the true heir to Lenin's legacy, emphasizing his supposed devotion to Leninism. Meanwhile, he portrayed Trotsky as a dangerous intellectual, too distant from the needs of the workers and, crucially, too arrogant to represent the common Soviet citizen. One of Stalin's greatest strengths lay in his ability to play his rivals against one another. Early on, he aligned himself with Zinoviev and Kamenev to marginalize Trotsky, accusing him of being too radical and insufficiently loyal to Lenin's vision. Trotsky's own missteps helped Stalin's case. His sharp critiques of the party's direction alienated his peers, and his decision to skip Lenin's funeral due to either illness or misinformation gave Stalin the perfect opportunity to overshadow him. Stalin, in contrast, positioned himself as Lenin's torchbearer by delivering a carefully staged and public display of mourning, burnishing his credentials in front of the party and the public. Once Trotsky was sidelined, Stalin turned to Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had initially supported him. By manipulating alliances and leveraging his growing control over party organs, he painted his former collaborators as factionalists who were undermining party unity. Both men were systematically stripped of their positions, and by the late 1920s, they found themselves politically isolated. Stalin's campaign to discredit and neutralize his opponents was far-reaching. Speeches, official reports, and even history books were altered to bolster his narrative. By the end of the decade, Stalin had emerged as the uncontested leader of the Soviet Union. His rise coincided with dramatic shifts in policy. Stalin rejected the new economic policy, dismissing it as a betrayal of socialist principles, and instead called for centralized planning and rapid industrialization. His vision for the Soviet Union was clear: a powerful, modern state, free from capitalist influence, capable of dominating the global stage. But this transformation would come at an extraordinary cost, and Stalin's methods of achieving it would define the terror of his regime. To secure this vision, Stalin worked to consolidate control over every facet of Soviet life. The secret police, restructured as the GPU and later the NKVD, became central to his reign, ensuring that dissent, real or imagined, was silenced. Surveillance was omnipresent, fear was systemic, and the party grew intertwined with Stalin's image to the point where opposing him equated to opposing the state itself. His rise also brought the beginning of the infamous cult of personality, where propaganda presented Stalin as a near mythic leader, wise, infallible, and always aligned with the people. One of Stalin's more peculiar tactics was his obsessive erasure of rivals, not only from positions of power, but from the record of history itself. Photographs were edited, documents vanished, and those who had worked alongside Stalin often found themselves disappearing, literally and figuratively. Even owning a photograph where purged individuals appeared unedited could lead to arrest. These acts of revision painted a picture of Stalin as the lone architect of Soviet success, reshaping how history itself was told to suit his needs. In the late 1920s, Stalin began implementing collectivization, a sweeping policy that upended the lives of millions of Soviet peasants. The plan forced farmers to abandon private ownership of land and livestock in favor of joining state-controlled collective farms, known as kolkhozes. Stalin justified this move with lofty promises. Collectivization, he claimed, would modernize agriculture, ensure food security, and provide surplus grain for export, all while funding the industrialization of Soviet cities. But the reality was far grimier. Beneath the rhetoric of efficiency was an ironclad intent to crush private farming, eliminate class distinctions in the countryside, and assert state control over food production. For many Soviet farmers, especially the so-called kulaks, a label broadly applied to wealthier peasants, this policy became a nightmare. The kulaks were singled out as scapegoats for resisting collectivization, though in reality, kulak often had little to do with wealth. Many were simply independent farmers who owned slightly more land or livestock than their neighbors. Stalin marked them as enemies of the state, branding them as exploiters who hoarded grain and undermined socialism. Kulaks and their families faced brutal punishments. Some were arrested and exiled to remote labor camps, others were executed, and countless more were stripped of their homes and belongings. The campaign against them, known as dekulakization, was not only violent but indiscriminate, with even moderate farmers swept into its still growing backlash. Resistance spread quickly. Peasants, furious at losing land that had often been in their families for generations, destroyed livestock and crops rather than surrender them to the state. Between 1929 and 1933, millions of animals were slaughtered. Cows, horses, and pigs that previously fueled the rural economy were wiped out. Far from increasing agricultural output, these acts of defiance deepened the crisis. Production plummeted, but Stalin pressed on, determined to enforce his vision at any cost. The most catastrophic outcome of collectivization unfolded in Ukraine, where Stalin's policies collided with resistance in a deadly way. Known as the Holodomor, this man-made famine from 1932 to 1933 devastated the region and claimed the lives of an estimated 3 to 4 million people. Grain requisitions, the systematic seizure of food for export and state-controlled redistribution, left rural villages with nothing. Families starved to death in their homes, their fields stripped bare by the state. Those caught hiding food, speaking out, or protesting were arrested, or worse. Publicly, the Soviet leadership denied the famine's existence. Internationally, they continued to export grain at the same time Ukrainians were dying en masse. The silence was strategic. Revealing the crisis would expose the failures of collectivization, undermining both domestic control and foreign credibility. Those who dared to mention starvation, even in private, risked imprisonment or execution. Some survivors later reported that people were forbidden to use the word famine at all. It was not merely a tragedy. To the state, it didn't exist. For villagers facing starvation, survival sometimes led to grim choices. Secret reports from Soviet authorities documented instances of cannibalism during the worst months. Families torn apart by desperation turned to unthinkable measures to stay alive. And even as they suffered, the state punished survivors of the famine for what the government labeled violations, such as eating seed grain or failing to deliver grain quotas. Succumbing to hunger brought shame, not sympathy, in the eyes of the regime. Though collectivization achieved Stalin's goal of full state control over agriculture, the human cost was staggering. Traditional rural life was destroyed. Millions of peasants were transformed into dependent laborers on state-run farms, and entire generations carried the scars of hunger and repression. Despite the devastation, the Soviet government declared the policy of victory, citing the industrial growth funded by grain exports and the elimination of land ownership as proof of its success. But for the countless lives crushed by hunger, deportation, and fear, this victory came at a price that could never be repaid. In 1928, Stalin introduced the first five-year plan, launching one of the most ambitious economic transformations in history. The Soviet Union, still struggling to recover from years of civil war and famine, was to be reshaped into a global industrial powerhouse. The plan's emphasis was on heavy industry, steel, coal, oil, and machinery, while consumer goods and living standards were deemed secondary priorities. Stalin envisioned a self-sufficient Soviet Union, immune to the influence of foreign capitalism and prepared to outpace its rivals on the global stage. With century-planned quotas dictating every sector, the state sought nothing less than complete control over the economy. Meeting these goals was easier said than done. Targets were not just ambitious, they were often wildly unrealistic. Factories were ordered to double or triple production overnight, regardless of whether they had the means. Still, reports of success poured in, with Soviet officials eager to keep up appearances. Infrastructure projects became showcases of this rapid development. Entire cities sprang up in remote areas, their construction fueled by a mix of determination and coercion. Magnitogorsk, for instance, rose from barren wilderness to become a massive hub of steel production, reflecting the scale and urgency of Stalin's vision. Interestingly, American engineers with experience from factories like Henry Ford's were quietly hired to design these Soviet industrial complexes, making Magnitogorsk's success partially reliant on foreign expertise, despite the state's rhetoric of independence. Much of the heavy lifting, literally, was done by forced labor. The USSR's expanding prison system, including the infamous gulags, provided a workforce for grueling projects under the harshest conditions. These prisoners toiled in mines, laid railroads, and worked on complex undertakings, like the White Sea-Baltic Canal, often with little more than hand tools. Mortality rates were staggering, as exhaustion, disease, and extreme weather took their toll. Regular workers faced their own brutal environments with harsh quotas, unsafe conditions, and the constant risk of punishment for failing to meet expectations. Factories monitored their employees closely, and those who fell behind faced public humiliation, pay cuts, or even charges of sabotage, often leading to imprisonment. Despite the inefficiencies and human cost, the industrial gains by the end of the plan were undeniable. The USSR increased its steel production by nearly 40%, electrified vast rural areas, and began producing its own tractors, machinery, and military equipment. These achievements startled much of the world, especially considering the Great Depression's economic toll on capitalist nations during the same period. Propaganda celebrated these victories relentlessly, presenting workers as heroes, driving the Soviet Union to greatness. Alexei Stakhanov became a household name after reportedly mining 14 times his daily coal quota in one shift, a story broadcast to inspire workers across the country. Whether exaggerated or not, Stakhanov's tale became central to Soviet imagery, emphasizing the values of hard work and sacrifice for the state. The rise of industry, however, was not without profound consequences for society. Urbanization skyrocketed as millions migrated to cities in search of work. But the rapid growth left these urban centers struggling to accommodate the influx of laborers. Housing shortages became severe, with families crammed into shared apartments or living in temporary barracks near construction sites. Access to basic amenities like clean water and reliable sanitation lagged far behind the population boom, creating difficult conditions for the newly industrialized workforce. Food supplies, too, strained under the pressure. While industrial centers prioritized grain shipments for workers, shortages persisted, leaving many families relying on cramped rations. By the late 1930s, Stalin had transformed the Soviet Union into an industrial superpower, capable of producing weapons, machinery, and heavy equipment at unprecedented levels. Yet these accomplishments came at immense human cost. The forced labor, the crushing demands on workers, and the lives lost to reckless ambition were the unseen price of what Stalin's government declared an overwhelming success. Even as the Soviet Union began to rival Western powers in terms of industrial capacity, the system that built this achievement left deep scars on its people. In the mid-1930s, Stalin unleashed the Great Purge, or the Great Terror, a campaign of repression so sweeping that no corner of Soviet society was safe. Ostensibly aimed at rooting out enemies of the people, the Purge evolved into a tool for Stalin to eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat to his absolute control. Whether these threats were real or imagined hardly mattered. Loyal communists, military leaders, intellectuals, public officials, and even ordinary citizens were caught up in the frenzy. Accusations ranged from espionage to sabotage, to vague charges of counter-revolutionary activities. Reality held little weight. A simple denunciation could destroy lives overnight. One of the most chilling hallmarks of the Purge was the staged show trial. Prominent Bolsheviks who had once been close to Lenin, figures like Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, were paraded into courts, their confessions broadcast to the world. The charges were often absurd, plotting with foreign governments, assassinating party officials, and conspiring against the revolution. These men, reduced to shells of their former selves after relentless torture and imprisonment, would confess in theatrical displays, knowing the verdict was predetermined. Publicly humiliated and branded as traitors, they were shot soon after. Through these showcases, Stalin aimed to rewrite history itself, erasing the contributions of his predecessors and solidifying his claim to being the sole custodian of Lenin's legacy. The Purge extended to the Red Army, where Stalin's paranoia led to the arrest and execution of thousands of officers, including most top commanders. Entire layers of leadership were wiped out just as Europe moved toward war, leaving the Soviet military dangerously unprepared for Nazi Germany's invasion. Parallel to these executions was the expansion of the Gulag system, a sprawling network of forced labor camps scattered across the Soviet Union's most inhospitable regions. Millions were arrested on suspicion of disloyalty, often following denunciations by neighbors, coworkers, or even family members. In Stalin's Soviet Union, fear permeated everything. A wrong word, a past association, or even pure bad luck could land someone in the camps. Once there, prisoners faced unimaginable conditions: freezing winters in Siberia, sweltering summers in the deserts, and constant hard labor building railways, factories, or even entire cities. Starvation, disease, and exhaustion claimed countless lives, yet quotas for work were rarely adjusted to account for rampant deaths. Despite the suffering, the Gulag system became an integral part of the Soviet economy. Entire industrial projects relied on this pool of expendable labor. Railways connecting remote regions, built by prisoners, mining operations for the state, fueled by tens of thousands of inmates. One camp even boasted luxuries like a theater and football league, though harsher realities always reigned behind the barbed wire. By the late 1930s, the gulags weren't just prisons. They were vital tools for Stalin's vision of a modernized Soviet machine, albeit one paid for in lives. By 1939, the sheer scale of the Great Purge had left a scar across Soviet society. Over 1.5 million were executed during this time, and millions more either died in labor camps or were exiled to desolate regions. Paranoia reshaped personal relationships as deeply as it fractured institutions. Parents feared their own children, workers betrayed coworkers, and silence became a survival strategy in an era where trust could easily prove fatal. What began as a quest for political control consumed a nation, leaving behind fear, humiliation, and devastation cloaked in the rhetoric of progress and security. Stalin's unrelenting grip had been solidified, but only through unprecedented brutality. In August 1939, a stunning political partnership emerged that took the world by surprise. The Soviet Union, symbolizing communist ideology, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, a regime embodying fascism. Despite their seemingly irreconcilable ideologies, both powers had overlapping priorities: territorial expansion and temporary peace along their borders. Through what was publicly presented as a non-aggression treaty, the two nations agreed not to attack one another. However, a concealed part of the pact, the secret protocol, was where the real intentions lay. In it, the USSR and Germany divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence, essentially plotting the fates of countries like Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states. Within days, Germany invaded Poland from the west, triggering Britain and France to enter World War II. The Soviets moved quickly after, taking control of the eastern half of Poland. This joint action partitioned the country, erasing its sovereignty almost overnight. Shortly after, the Soviet Union's reach kept expanding. Stalin ordered the annexation of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, while pressing territorial demands on Finland, which refused to give in. This led to the bitter Winter War of 1939 to 1940, where Soviet forces faced unexpectedly fierce resistance from the Finnish military, costing the Red Army heavy losses despite their eventual gains. Stalin also claimed parts of Romania, redrawing the borders of Eastern Europe in a matter of months. For Stalin, the pact was a strategic move. He believed it would buy him time to strengthen Soviet defenses, while Nazi Germany dealt with Western Europe. By pushing the USSR's borders westward through annexations, he hoped to create a buffer zone against potential German aggression. However, this calculation came at a steep cost. Stalin ignored or dismissed multiple warnings about Hitler's true intentions, including intelligence from his own spies, the British, and even direct evidence provided by a deserting German soldier. Convinced these were British attempts to drag him into war prematurely, Stalin allowed his military forces to remain ill-prepared. The consequences of this miscalculation became painfully clear on June 22, 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa. The scale of this invasion was unprecedented. Millions of Axis troops stormed Soviet territory, backed by thousands of tanks and aircraft. Entire Soviet divisions were overwhelmed, with millions of soldiers captured within the first few months. Nazi forces swept across vast regions, including Ukraine and Belarus, prompting staggering losses for the Red Army. Key cities fell, and Stalin himself, initially paralyzed by the betrayal, went silent for days as chaos unfolded. Eventually, Stalin regained his composure and radically reorganized the war effort. Abandoning strict communist rhetoric, he rebranded the conflict as the Great Patriotic War, a desperate fight for national survival. This framing helped unify the population. Propaganda posters and radio broadcasts rallied citizens to defend the motherland from invasion. Even individuals with grievances against the regime found themselves fighting for their homeland against a common enemy. Despite these efforts, the aftermath of the initial invasion left scars across the Soviet Union that would take years to heal. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, initially seen by Stalin as a triumph of Soviet policy, had now turned into one of its greatest misjudgments. While the USSR temporarily gained land and influence in Eastern Europe, the pact also exposed countries like Poland to unimaginable devastation and stained the international reputation of both signatories. Stalin's willingness to collaborate with Hitler revealed the pragmatic and ruthless nature of Soviet foreign policy. Ironically, this agreement, intended to prolong peace, served only to accelerate the USSR's entry into World War II under devastatingly unprepared conditions. One absurd yet telling detail underscores the situation. In the weeks leading up to Barbarossa, Soviet intelligence intercepted over 80 separate warnings about an impending invasion. Stalin rejected them all, some personally, convinced they were disinformation. Even after German troops massed on the border, Soviet officers were ordered not to provoke them, leaving key aircraft grounded and awaiting destruction. This mix of denial and miscalculation set the stage for unparalleled destruction as the USSR entered its bloodiest era. After the shock of Hitler's betrayal in 1941, the Soviet Union faced a life-or-death struggle. The initial months of Operation Barbarossa had left the Red Army shattered. Entire divisions were annihilated, and valuable industrial regions in the West had fallen to the advancing Germans. Stalin and his leadership scrambled to respond. In a dramatic effort to rebuild the war effort, the USSR began relocating critical industries thousands of kilometers eastward to protect them from German airstrikes. Factories, machinery, and even workers were packed onto trains and moved beyond the Ural Mountains. Despite the chaos, this relocation worked. Within months, production resumed deep in the Soviet interior, supplying much-needed tanks, artillery, and ammunition for the front lines. The Red Army itself had to undergo radical reorganization. Morale was dangerously low, with soldiers overwhelmed by constant defeats. Stalin issued a historic decree that would define Soviet resistance. Order number 227, better known by its infamous phrase, "not one step back." This order forbade retreat under any circumstances. Special blocking units were stationed behind Soviet lines, tasked with preventing soldiers from fleeing, even at gunpoint. Penal battalions, made up of convicted soldiers and political prisoners, were used for the most dangerous missions, essentially as expendable forces. Although these measures were brutal, they reflected the desperation of the situation and contributed to hardening Soviet defenses. One of the greatest tests of Soviet resilience came with the siege of Leningrad. For nearly 900 days, German and Finnish forces encircled the city, cutting off all land routes for supplies. Starvation ravaged the civilian population, and over 1 million people died, many from hunger alone. The city, however, refused to submit. Civilians worked tirelessly to build fortifications and operate weapons. Music concerts were held to maintain morale, even as shells rained down. Supply routes across frozen Lake Ladoga, known as the Road of Life, became a lifeline during the harshest winters. Leningrad's survival became a symbol of Soviet determination. By late 1942, the tide of war began to shift with the Battle of Stalingrad. This brutal months-long conflict featured intense urban combat, where entire city blocks were destroyed and battles measured in inches. Soviet forces, commanded by General Zhukov, turned the tables on the Germans by encircling and trapping their Sixth Army. Starving and isolated, the German troops were forced to surrender in early 1943. This victory marked not only a turning point on the Eastern Front, but also an unmistakable signal that the Red Army was regaining its strength and confidence. Women became an essential part of the Soviet war effort, both behind the scenes and on the battlefield. Female snipers like Lyudmila Pavlichenko became legends for their precision, while all-female air regiments, such as the famous Night Witches, carried out daring bombing raids in obsolete biplanes. On the home front, women staffed factories, produced weapons, and kept supply chains running. Their contributions weren't just significant, they were vital to the USSR's survival. At its industrial peak, the Soviet Union outpaced German production in key areas, particularly tanks. The T-34, renowned for its versatility and simplicity, became the backbone of the Red Army. Meanwhile, Soviet partisans, operating behind enemy lines, sabotaged German railroads, disrupted supply lines, and proved to be a constant thorn in the Wehrmacht's side. These partisan efforts forced the Germans to divert resources they couldn't spare, weakening their positions on the front. By 1945, the Red Army had transformed from a defeated force into one capable of decisive victories. Fighting their way into Eastern Europe, Soviet troops stormed Berlin in April, raising their flag atop the Reichstag in one of the war's most iconic moments. But victory came at an unimaginable cost. Over 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians died during the war, making the Soviet Union's sacrifice the highest of any nation involved. The devastation across the USSR would leave scars for decades. Incredibly, even in the darkest days, Soviet ingenuity found ways to strike fear into the enemy. The Night Witches, an all-female squadron, conducted bombing raids so quietly that German soldiers believed they were haunting spirits. Flying outdated planes, they would cut their engines before releasing bombs, relying on silence as their weapon. It was this blend of grit, sacrifice, and ingenuity that ultimately drove the Soviet war effort to victory, one that secured the survival of the USSR but left deep wounds across its society and people. By 1945, the Soviet Union stood victorious over Nazi Germany, its military occupying vast swaths of Eastern and Central Europe. This wasn't just a military triumph. It was the moment Stalin sought to secure the USSR's position as a global superpower. No longer isolated, the Soviet Union now held sway over a dozen nations, using its victory to expand its influence and reshape the post-war world. But that influence didn't come freely. It was cemented through military presence, political coercion, and the creation of loyal communist regimes. In a series of behind-the-scenes deals, the Yalta and Potsdam conferences saw Stalin negotiating directly with Allied leaders Churchill, Roosevelt, and later Truman. While publicly these meetings were about restoring peace, much of the discussion focused on carving up Europe into spheres of influence. the Soviet Union insisted on a buffer zone of friendly states, citing the devastation wrought by 3 invasions in just the past 150 years: Napoleon, World War I's Central Powers, and now Nazi Germany. Stalin envisioned Eastern Europe as a defensive wall against future threats. What unfolded was a swift, systematic push to install communist governments across the region. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, the so-called Eastern Bloc, became satellites of the USSR, ostensibly independent but tightly controlled from Moscow. The boundaries of the Soviet Union itself were also redrawn, marking its greatest territorial expansion. Stalin reincorporated the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, absorbed eastern Poland, parts of Finland, and took territories from Romania and Germany. At its peak in 1946, the Soviet Union controlled a landmass that stretched across 11 time zones. However, these acquisitions came with significant friction internationally, particularly with Western allies, who argued that Stalin's occupation policies violated promises of free elections and liberated countries. What began as uneasy cooperation during the war was now unraveling, replacing wartime alliances with a mounting suspicion that would drive the Cold War. On the home front, the war allowed Stalin to consolidate his grip over the Soviet Union. Victory wasn't merely a military achievement. It was used to justify the continuation of his authoritarian rule. The immense sacrifices made during the war became the cornerstone of his legitimacy. Propaganda depicted Stalin as the architect of victory, a leader whose firm hand saved the nation from annihilation. Meanwhile, repression didn't ease in this post-war era. Political opponents, war prisoners accused of collaboration, even displaced persons returning from Nazi-controlled territories. Many ended up in the ever-expanding Gulag system. Economically, the Soviet Union rejected the U.S. Marshall Plan, which aimed to rebuild Europe through American economic aid, seeing it as a ploy to expand capitalist influence. Instead, Stalin doubled down on creating an independent economic sphere. Comecon, or the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, became the Soviet framework for Eastern Bloc economies. However, rebuilding was slow. Industries lay in ruins. Cities like Stalingrad and Leningrad bore scars of immense destruction, and resources were stretched thin. Still, investment in heavy industry surged, partly fueled by reparations from Axis powers, including forced labor programs and technology seized from occupied territories. Science, too, became a focal point of post-war rebuilding. The USSR had captured tens of thousands of German scientists, engineers, and technicians, many of whom were instrumental in building its early missile and space programs. One standout example was rocket engineer Helmut Grotrup, who alongside his team helped lay the groundwork for Soviet military advances during the Cold War. Soviet innovation wasn't just about destruction, though. Many of these developments found their way into civilian industries, fueling progress in areas from chemistry to aviation. Through it all, Stalin's vision for a communist ideological offensive persisted. In 1949, the USSR founded Cominform, a coordination bureau aimed at unifying communist parties worldwide. This wasn't simply about securing the Eastern Bloc. It was about spreading Marxist-Leninist doctrine as a global alternative to Western capitalism. However, the deeper the USSR pushed its ideological agenda, the wider the divide grew between East and West, with tension surfacing in nearly every diplomatic interaction. After the Second World War, the alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western powers began to unravel almost immediately, giving rise to the Cold War, a period of intense rivalry that defined global politics for decades. While ideological differences between capitalism in the West and communism in the East had always been present, the post-war settlement brought those differences into sharp focus. Europe was divided, both militarily and politically, along an invisible line, later famously described by Winston Churchill as the Iron Curtain. On one side was the Soviet-controlled Eastern Bloc, a region defined by pro-communist regimes loyal to Moscow. On the other side, Western nations aligned with the United States. Nowhere was this divide more apparent than in Berlin, a city physically split into East and West, embodying the larger tensions of this new era. The emerging arms race quickly overtook any hope of reconciliation. The United States, having dropped atomic bombs on Japan to end the war, had assumed a brief monopoly on nuclear weapons. But this dominance didn't last long. In 1949, the Soviet Union stunned the world by successfully detonating its first atomic bomb, codenamed RDS-1. Western intelligence had estimated that the Soviets wouldn't achieve this milestone for several more years, highlighting a stark intelligence failure. Behind this triumph, however, was extensive espionage. Soviet intelligence services had infiltrated Western nuclear programs. Figures like Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist working in the Manhattan Project, provided key information that accelerated Moscow's efforts. The Rosenbergs, an American couple later executed for espionage, were also implicated on passing nuclear secrets to the USSR. The successful test of RDS-1 initiated a frantic nuclear arms race between the two superpowers. Both the United States and the Soviet Union began ramping up their production of atomic weaponry. By 1952, the Americans had developed the hydrogen bomb, a weapon far more powerful than its predecessors. The Soviets followed suit in 1953. This escalation introduced a grim new concept of global military strategy, mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was simple but terrifying. With both nations capable of obliterating each other entirely, neither could afford to act on its threats. Paradoxically, this guarantee of total annihilation helped prevent direct conflict, forcing the Cold War into proxies and political standoffs rather than open warfare. For the Soviet Union, the arms race was more than just a military endeavor. Each test represented not only a step forward in military strength, but also a demonstration of ideological superiority. Stalin saw the nuclear program as a political weapon as much as a technological one, using it to project the USSR's global standing. Beyond the bomb, Soviet efforts extended into the support of communist revolutions and governments worldwide. Moscow funded movements across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, presenting itself as the champion of anti-colonialism and socialism. These acts, in turn, stoked Western fears of communist expansion, further escalating tensions. Meanwhile, Stalin's later years were marked by increasing paranoia and domestic repression. The dictator, fearing betrayal even within his closest circles, ramped up targeted purges. One of the most infamous instances was the Doctors' Plot in 1952, an alleged conspiracy involving Jewish doctors accused of trying to assassinate Soviet leaders. The plot is now widely understood as an anti-Semitic purge, but it escalated fears of internal enemies. However, Stalin's death in 1953 abruptly halted these campaigns. His passing tipped the Soviet leadership into a power struggle, but also ushered in a slight easing of Cold War tensions under his successors. When Joseph Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union held its breath. After nearly 3 decades of fear and repression under his iron-fisted leadership, a vacuum of power emerged, and with it, a chance for significant change. Nikita Khrushchev, a seemingly unassuming figure, slowly yet carefully maneuvered his way to the top, defeating major rivals like Lavrentiy Beria, the notorious former head of the secret police, and the more conservative Georgy Malenkov. This process wasn't smooth. Power struggles behind closed doors defined the early post-Stalin years. But by 1956, Khrushchev cemented his position as first among equals, and the direction of the USSR began to shift. Then came the bombshell. In February of 1956, during a closed session of the 20th Party Congress, Khrushchev delivered what became known as the secret speech. In a tone filled with condemnation and shock, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's cult of personality, his purges, and the terror that had gripped the nation for decades. He painted Stalin as a leader who betrayed Leninist ideals, ruling by fear rather than collective leadership. This was unprecedented. Open criticism of Stalin, while still calculated to avoid implicating party loyalists, sent ripples through the USSR and the wider communist world. For the first time, the Soviet leadership took tentative steps toward reflection and reform. Khrushchev's denunciation wasn't entirely altruistic. It struck a blow to hardliners, clearing the path for his more reform-minded policies. This moment marked the beginning of what would later be called the Khrushchev Thaw. It wasn't a radical overhaul of the authoritarian system, but it was a significant pivot. Political prisoners were released in waves from gulags. Censorship eased slightly, allowing for limited criticism of past mistakes through literature and film. Artistic and intellectual circles, long stifled by fear, began cautiously exploring themes of oppression and humanity, most notably in works like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. The Soviet people, accustomed to silence, finally had the faintest glimmer of openness, even if it was tightly controlled. Khrushchev also turned his attention to economic reform, though his policies yielded mixed results. He sought to move away from Stalin's focus on heavy industry and military production, shifting some emphasis toward consumer goods and agriculture. His enthusiasm for corn, yes, corn, led to aggressive campaigns to expand his cultivation within the USSR. Inspired by American farming techniques, Khrushchev believed corn could become the backbone of Soviet agriculture. Unfortunately, poorly planned implementation in unsuitable climates led to widespread failures, earning the policy ridicule. On the urban side, Khrushchev championed mass housing projects. Millions of Khrushchevkas, functional but Spartan apartment blocks, were built to address overcrowded cities. While they lacked the grandeur of Stalin-era architecture, they were efficient and affordable, providing homes to countless families. However, the thaw had its boundaries. In October 1956, the Hungarian uprising broke out, shaking the Eastern Bloc. Inspired by Khrushchev's critiques of Stalinism, Hungarians demanded democratic reforms and freedom from Soviet control. For a brief moment, it looked as though the Soviet grip on its satellites might loosen. But when protests escalated into armed rebellion, Khrushchev responded decisively. Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, crushing the uprising with brutal efficiency. Thousands died. The uprising's suppression sent a clear message: liberty within the Eastern Bloc had its limits. Khrushchev's leadership was often defined by contradiction. Abroad, he boldly confronted the West in televised showdowns like the infamous kitchen debate with U.S. Vice President Richard Nixon. At the same time, his erratic behavior, including a famous moment where he allegedly banged his shoe at the United Nations in 1960, overshadowed his accomplishments. These inconsistencies frustrated party officials at home, and by 1964, they'd had enough. Khrushchev was summoned to a surprise meeting of the Politburo, where he was quietly forced into retirement. His removal ended the era of cautious optimism that defined the Thaw and ushered in a new period of conservatism under Leonid Brezhnev. Khrushchev's legacy remains polarizing. He opened windows just enough to let in fresh air, but slammed them shut when the breeze became unsettling. Still, his thaw, though brief, planted seeds of reform that wouldn't take full root until much later in Soviet history. His leadership was far from smooth, but it revealed cracks in the foundation of a seemingly unshakable system. Even today, some wonder if his course could have changed history, or if the Soviet Union was always destined to stagnate. The Cold War wasn't just waged on Earth. It expanded into the boundless possibilities of outer space. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a fierce competition, not only over ideology and military strength, but now over who would claim technological dominance in the final frontier. With scientists and engineers racing to turn theoretical physics into practical innovation, space became a potent symbol of progress and power. The stakes weren't limited to rockets and satellites. Every launch served as a political message about which system, capitalism or communism, was truly the future of humanity. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite. The polished, beach ball-sized object marked the beginning of the space age. Simply by emitting regular radio pulses, Sputnik became a global sensation, grabbing headlines and sparking fear in the United States. For Moscow, it was a propaganda coup, positioning the USSR as a technological trailblazer. Less than a month later, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2. This time, the satellite carried Laika, a stray dog from the streets of Moscow who became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Although Laika didn't survive the mission, her journey underscored Soviet ambition and the program's willingness to push boundaries. The Soviet Union continued to seize milestones, building a steady lead in the early years of the space race. In 1959, the Luna 2 spacecraft became the first human-made object to reach the Moon, crashing into its surface in a moment that caught worldwide attention. Shortly after, Luna 3 captured the first-ever photos of the Moon's far side, revealing a landscape humans had never seen. Each step came with powerful propaganda value, cementing the narrative that communism was driving humanity's most extraordinary achievements. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, completing a full orbit of the Earth aboard Vostok 1. He was instantly celebrated as a Soviet hero, his image promoted worldwide as proof of communist progress. Yet the mission hid a key risk. Vostok lacked landing controls, and Gagarin had to eject and parachute down, a fact the USSR kept quiet to maintain the illusion of perfection. Behind the glittering achievements, however, lay a string of failures the USSR worked hard to hide. Launchpad explosions, botched missions, and unconfirmed rumors of cosmonauts lost in space were covered up or erased from public records. The program functioned in secrecy, where publicized triumphs masked the immense challenges of pushing experimental technology. This secrecy also extended to the human cost, as incidents like the Nedelin catastrophe, a tragic missile explosion that killed hundreds in 1960, were suppressed for decades. The early Soviet successes jolted the United States into action. NASA ramped up efforts under immense pressure, pouring resources into catching up. This competition culminated in the Apollo moon landing in 1969, where the US finally overtook the USSR in the space spotlight. Despite this, the Soviets remained innovative. In 1971, they launched the world's first space station, Salyut-1, an ambitious effort to establish a longer-term human presence in space. Tragically, the Soyuz 11 crew, returning from Salyut-1, died when their spacecraft depressurized, a catastrophe kept hidden from the public for years. In October 1962, humanity hovered on the edge of catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded over 13 agonizingly tense days, during which the United States and the Soviet Union came closer to nuclear war than ever before. It began with a discovery, one that electrified American intelligence. Soviet nuclear missile installations were being built in Cuba, just 90 miles from the U.S. coastline. High-altitude reconnaissance photos taken by American spy planes revealed unmistakable evidence of long-range missiles capable of striking deep into the United States. For the Kennedy administration, the threat was more than strategic, it was existential. The missiles in Cuba weren't just a random gamble by Khrushchev. Instead, they were a calculated response to American nuclear weapons already stationed in Turkey, which bordered the Soviet Union, and posed a direct threat to its security. Khrushchev also saw an opportunity to bolster Cuba, his only staunch ally in the Western Hemisphere, after the failed US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion a year earlier. Placing missiles in Cuba would signal to the world that Moscow was willing to go to any length to defend communist allies and undermine American dominance in its own backyard. Upon learning of the Soviet missile sites, President John F. Kennedy swiftly convened his closest advisors in what became known as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM. The group debated various responses. Some favored an immediate airstrike on the missile sites, while others advocated for a full military invasion of Cuba. Ultimately, Kennedy opted for a naval blockade, or what he framed as a quarantine around the island. This move, while confrontational, stopped short of outright escalation, giving Khrushchev time to respond without immediate retaliation. The term quarantine was intentionally chosen to avoid the connotations of an act of war. Tension escalated rapidly as both sides prepared for potential conflict. Soviet ships carrying additional military equipment sailed toward Cuba, while U.S. military forces were placed on DEFCON 2, the second highest state of alert, just one step away from nuclear war. For nearly 2 weeks, diplomacy played out in a game of brinkmanship, with each side trying to force the other to back down without losing face. Publicly, Kennedy demanded the immediate removal of the missiles. Privately, letters were exchanged between the White House and the Kremlin, proposing potential resolutions that neither side could fully trust. Finally, Khrushchev relented. He agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public guarantee from the United States not to invade the island. But there was more to the deal than met the eye. Behind closed doors, Kennedy also agreed to remove U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey, a concession kept secret from the public for years. The crisis, which had brought the world terrifyingly close to disaster, was resolved without a single shot being fired. Yet the fallout lingered, especially in the Soviet Union. While Khrushchev framed the agreement as a triumph of Soviet diplomacy, his decision to back down came across as a humiliation to many within his own government. This perception of faltering resolve added fuel to the dissatisfaction that would ultimately lead to his removal 2 years later. Despite the political damage, the Cuban Missile Crisis left behind some unexpected positives. Both superpowers, shaken by their brush with nuclear annihilation, took steps to prevent future close calls. The crisis led to the establishment of the Moscow-Washington Hotline, a direct communication link designed to allow quick and clear dialogue between the two leaders. It also spurred the first attempts at arms control agreements between the US and the USSR, though both nations would continue to expand their stockpiles for years. One moment from the crisis provides a chilling glimpse into how easily things could have gone wrong. On October 27th, the Soviets deployed a submarine armed with a nuclear torpedo near Cuba. US naval forces had begun dropping depth charges to force the submarine to surface. Believing war might have already begun, the submarine's captain prepared to launch the torpedo. Only the second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize the strike, persuading the crew to hold off. That single decision likely averted a chain reaction that could have ended in global disaster. When Leonid Brezhnev took power in 1964, after Nikita Khrushchev's dramatic ousting, the Soviet Union entered an era defined by stability, or more precisely, stagnation. Brezhnev aimed to reverse many of Khrushchev's erratic and ambitious policies, choosing conservatism as his guiding principle. His leadership prioritized order over experimentation, and any attempts at reform were largely sidelined in favor of maintaining a tightly controlled status quo. For Brezhnev, predictability and centralized authority were the cornerstones of a developed socialist society, though in practice, this approach gradually dulled the system's innovation and flexibility. Under Brezhnev, the state tightened its grip on every aspect of Soviet life. Heavy censorship smothered creative expression, with newspapers, books, and films limited to content that aligned with the Communist Party's message. Writers, thinkers, and scientists who stepped outside these boundaries risked imprisonment or exile, as dissent became synonymous with betrayal. Surveillance by the KGB remained ubiquitous, ensuring that oppositional voices, however small, were swiftly silenced. While Brezhnev avoided the violent purges of Stalin's time, the era still cultivated a sense of quiet repression, where conformity trumped individuality. Internationally, the Soviet Union continued to project its military and ideological power. The Brezhnev Doctrine, introduced in 1968, formalized Moscow's right to intervene in any socialist country to protect communist rule. Its application was demonstrated with brutal clarity during the Prague Spring. In Czechoslovakia, reformist leader Alexander Dubček introduced liberal reforms, including freedom of speech and decentralization. These changes, though hopeful for the Czech people, alarmed Brezhnev and the Politburo. Viewing such reforms as a threat to Soviet hegemony over the Eastern Bloc, the USSR led a Warsaw Pact invasion to crush the movement. This act became emblematic of the Brezhnev era: swift, unyielding control over the satellites, even at the expense of international condemnation. Domestically, Brezhnev oversaw an economy increasingly plagued by inefficiency and imbalance. The centralized planning system, once a symbol of Soviet strength, began to falter under rigid production quotas that prioritized quantity over quality. Factories churned out goods that were often defective or entirely unwanted, while consumer shortages plagued everyday life. The economy became heavily reliant on oil exports, which masked deeper structural issues for a time, thanks to high global oil prices in the 1970s. However, this dependence made the USSR particularly vulnerable to any shifts in the energy market. Despite extensive propaganda championing industrial progress, many Soviet citizens experienced declining living standards. Glass shelves in grocery stores and long lines for basic items became a defining image of the period. The Soviet leadership itself also changed under Brezhnev, though not in ways that inspired optimism. Instead of nurturing innovation, Brezhnev valued loyalty and stability above all else. Hardline officials, often more interested in preserving their power than solving problems, thrived in an environment that rewarded obedience over competence. Corruption flourished, with bribery and black market dealings becoming commonplace among officials at every level. Meritocracy, where it existed, eroded in favor of a system more interested in preventing change than promoting progress. Despite fostering stagnation, Brezhnev carefully cultivated the image of a powerful, dignified leader, one adorned with an extraordinary number of accolades. Obsessed with prestige, Brezhnev awarded himself over 100 medals during his tenure, including 4 Hero of the Soviet Union honors. His love for flattery sometimes bordered on the absurd. His jacket, weighed down by medals, reportedly required assistants to remain in place during ceremonial appearances. This excessive display of self-congratulation symbolized the gap between Soviet propaganda and its increasingly bleak realities. By the late 1970s, the cracks in the Brezhnev system had become impossible to ignore. While the USSR remained a formidable military superpower, its society lagged in critical areas like technology, healthcare, and the standard of living. The long stretches of inaction and bureaucratic gridlock came to define Brezhnev's tenure. What began as an era of stability slowly became one of stagnation, a period that traded reform for inertia at a cost the Soviet Union would struggle to recover from in the years ahead. In 1979, the Soviet Union launched a military intervention in Afghanistan, an event that would soon spiral into one of the USSR's most devastating and costly conflicts. The situation began with Afghanistan's communist government, which had seized power a year earlier in a coup. This new regime, under the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, pushed radical reforms aimed at transforming Afghan society along Soviet-style lines. But these changes, including land redistribution and secular policies, clashed with the country's deeply entrenched Islamic traditions, sparking widespread unrest. The PDPA soon found itself under siege from Islamic insurgents, known as Mujahideen, fighters who opposed both the government's ideology and its allegiance to Moscow. Fearing the collapse of a friendly regime on its southern border, the Soviet leadership decided to act. In December 1979, Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan, ostensibly to stabilize the situation and support their allies in Kabul. The invasion wasn't framed as an all-out war, but as a limited intervention. However, the reality was far from limited. Tens of thousands of Soviet troops rolled across the border, accompanied by tanks, helicopters, and warplanes. Within days, a coup orchestrated by the Soviets removed the PDPA leader Hafizullah Amin, installing Babrak Karmal, a figure they deemed more loyal and controllable. Yet, the new leadership changed little on the ground. The Mujahideen, scattered but fiercely motivated, continued to grow in strength, feeding on deep resentment toward the foreign occupiers. The conflict quickly evolved into a brutal guerrilla war. Afghanistan's rugged terrain, marked by towering mountains and isolated villages, proved ideal for the insurgents. Soviet tanks and heavy equipment struggled to navigate the narrow, winding routes, leaving them vulnerable to ambushes. The Red Army, though powerful on paper, was ill-prepared for the kind of decentralized hit-and-run warfare waged by the Mujahideen. Local knowledge of the terrain gave the rebels a significant edge, allowing them to strike and disappear before Soviet forces could mount an effective response. Airstrikes and helicopter missions often targeted suspected insurgent strongholds, but these operations also resulted in widespread destruction and heavy civilian casualties. As the war dragged on, the United States and its allies saw an opportunity to exploit Soviet vulnerabilities. Through a covert operation codenamed Operation Cyclone, the CIA began funneling arms, training, and financial aid to the Mujahideen. Billions of dollars worth of weapons, including surface-to-air missiles like the Stinger, made their way into Afghanistan, allowing the insurgents to counter Soviet air superiority. Neighboring Pakistan served as a staging ground and logistical base, while Saudi Arabia also contributed significant funding. What started as a localized uprising now carried the backing of global powers, transforming Afghanistan into a Cold War proxy battleground. The conflict strained the Soviet Union's resources and morale. Soviet soldiers faced not only a determined enemy, but also harsh conditions and growing disillusionment. Many conscripts, young and poorly trained, had little idea what they were fighting for in a country culturally and geographically foreign to them. Reports of wounded veterans and bodies returning home eroded public support for the war, especially since the Soviet government kept a tight lid on casualty numbers. By the war's end, over 15,000 Soviet soldiers had died, tens of thousands were wounded, and countless others bore psychological scars. Meanwhile, millions of Afghan civilians were killed, displaced, or driven into neighboring countries as refugees. Soviet tactics increasingly relied on scorched earth policies, carpet-bombing villages, planting landmines across vast areas, and targeting civilian infrastructure in an effort to root out the insurgents. These actions not only failed to subdue the Mujahideen, but also drew sharp international criticism. Afghanistan became a diplomatic quagmire for the USSR, signifying the high cost of projecting power abroad. By the mid-1980s, it was clear the war was unwinnable. Under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, who sought to reform a faltering Soviet system, the Kremlin began looking for a way out. In 1988, an agreement was brokered to withdraw Soviet troops, and by 1989, the last tanks rolled out of Afghanistan. The war left the Soviet Union deeply damaged, not only militarily and economically, but also in terms of its global reputation. It was often called the Soviet Vietnam, a conflict that exposed vulnerabilities in a superpower once thought undefeatable. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev was appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party. At just 54 years old, he was a stark departure from the elderly, stagnant leaders that had characterized Soviet leadership for decades. Gorbachev arrived with a vision to reform the increasingly fragile Soviet system, believing he could save socialism by modernizing it. His two primary policies, Perestroika and Glasnost, soon became the heart of his transformative agenda. Yet, what began as a controlled initiative to address inefficiency spiraled into an uncontrollable wave of change. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, aimed to breathe life into the stagnant economy, which had lagged under decades of rigid central planning. Gorbachev introduced measures that allowed for some market-like mechanisms, including private ownership of small businesses and greater autonomy for state enterprises. Managers were encouraged to act independently, increasing efficiency and productivity. He also cut back on heavy industry in favor of consumer goods, hoping to ease public frustration over chronic shortages. But instead of bolstering the economy, these changes disoriented it. Without an established framework for competition or regulation, production faltered and supply chain disruptions worsened existing shortages. While Gorbachev had hoped to stabilize the system, inflation soared and public confidence in the reforms quickly eroded. At the same time, Glasnost, meaning openness, radically transformed the social and political landscape. For the first time, transparency in government was encouraged. Censorship was relaxed, and the media gained freedom to report on political corruption, environmental disasters, and historical injustices, issues that had been suppressed for decades. This newfound openness allowed Soviet citizens to confront truths about their history, such as the brutality of Stalin's purges and the neglected cost of the ongoing war in Afghanistan. Public discourse erupted, with underground literature, known as samizdat, openly circulating. Once taboo books, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, were published and devoured by readers eager to learn what had happened in their own country. But this transparency came at a price. Rather than uniting the population around a shared vision of reform, Glasnost fueled resentment and emboldened critics, including nationalist movements in various Soviet republics. What became clear was that Gorbachev's policies were unlocking pent-up grievances far beyond Moscow's control. Across the Soviet Union, decades of suppressed ethnic tensions and desires for independence started boiling to the surface. In places like the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, open calls for secession began to challenge the very unity of the USSR. Even within the Russian heartland, trust in the party continued to fracture. Reformers criticized Gorbachev for not going far enough, while hardliners accused him of betraying socialism altogether. Isolated between these opposing forces, Gorbachev found himself stuck, unable to fully satisfy either side. Internationally, Gorbachev took significant steps to de-escalate Cold War tensions. He initiated arms reduction talks with the United States, eventually signing agreements like the INF Treaty, which eliminated entire categories of nuclear weapons. His charm and open demeanor won him praise abroad, and he was heralded for ending the decades-long arms race. Yet this did little to bolster his standing at home, where many conservatives in the party viewed his willingness to negotiate with the West as a dangerous weakness. Beyond the political isolation and economic challenges, Gorbachev's reforms also delivered unprecedented cultural shocks. Glasnost encouraged a surge of investigative journalism, with newspapers publishing gripping accounts of true crime, corruption, and the government's long-hidden scandals. Stories of Soviet labor camps, the horrors of Stalin's Great Terror, and even recent disasters, like the poorly handled Chernobyl nuclear meltdown, left the population rattled. Readers devoured publications hoping to make sense of their past, but also grew increasingly frustrated with their present. Yet perhaps the most telling symbol of Glasnost's unintended consequences was the public reaction to freedom itself. After decades of living in fear of repression, many Soviet citizens struggled to adapt to this unfamiliar openness. Social trust, long eroded by party surveillance and propaganda, couldn't be repaired overnight. Instead of a revitalized union, these reforms revealed a fragmented society in crisis. On April 26, 1986, a routine safety test at reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant spiraled into catastrophe. Late that night, operators attempted to simulate a power outage, but a flawed reactor design and poorly trained staff created a chain reaction of events they couldn't stop. Within moments, a massive explosion ripped through the reactor, sending a plume of radioactive material into the air. What the Soviets had built as a showcase of advanced nuclear technology became one of the most devastating nuclear disasters in history. The explosion didn't just affect Chernobyl or its surrounding area. Nuclear particles quickly spread across parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Wind patterns carried enough fallout to reach as far as Sweden and Germany, making it an international crisis. Radiation levels surged to unimaginable heights, but instead of immediately addressing the scope of the disaster, Soviet authorities hesitated, relying on secrecy and denial, core elements of the system. Even after the reactor's destruction, no official evacuations were ordered for nearly 2 days. Pripyat, the closest city to Chernobyl, continued as though nothing had happened. Families went about their daily lives, completely unaware they were being doused in toxic levels of radiation. When the truth could no longer be contained, the population of Pripyat, over 49,000 people, was evacuated in just hours, leaving behind their homes, jobs, and possessions. In total, more than 100,000 individuals from surrounding areas were ultimately forced to abandon their towns, many exposed to harmful doses of radiation that would haunt them for years. The authorities downplayed risks, even as Western countries began monitoring suspiciously high radiation levels crossing borders. When Sweden detected the radioactive surge over 1,000 kilometers away and demanded an explanation, the Soviet government was finally compelled to admit what had happened. The cleanup of Chernobyl became a Herculean task, one the state branded as an act of patriotism. This operation, called the liquidation, involved mobilizing over 600,000 workers to contain the damage. Soldiers, miners, firefighters, and engineers, dubbed liquidators, were sent into the dangerous zone with minimal preparation or proper safety equipment. Many worked directly next to the reactor's remains, using shovels and manual tools to clear radioactive debris, since the radiation levels were so high that even advanced machinery failed. These workers constructed a massive concrete sarcophagus to seal off reactor number 4, a temporary solution meant to prevent further radioactive leakage. However, for many of the liquidators, the exposure would lead to radiation sickness, long-term health complications, or death. Chernobyl drew a harsh spotlight onto the Soviet system, exposing deep flaws that went far beyond the immediate disaster. Investigations revealed that safety protocols had been cut for years, problems were ignored, and concerns from engineers had been silenced. Even the reactor's design, promoted as a symbol of Soviet scientific innovation, carried a known fatal flaw. It became dangerously unstable during low-power tests, like the one conducted that night. Above all, Chernobyl showcased how bureaucracy and fear of accountability had paralyzed meaningful action, costing lives unnecessarily. The Soviet government's slow response only confirmed what many citizens were already beginning to suspect under Gorbachev's Glasnost. Truth was buried for the sake of preserving appearances. The aftermath wasn't limited to structural damage or contaminated soil. Chernobyl's legacy includes a human cost that remains contested. Thousands of cancer diagnoses are tied to the fallout, while countless others lived with the trauma of displacement and severe disruptions to their lives. The exclusion zone, a 30-kilometer radius around the plant, remains uninhabited decades later, an eerie ghost town that feels frozen in time. One of the most shocking examples of official negligence came just days after the explosion. In Kyiv, roughly 100 kilometers from the reactor, children were still sent to participate in May Day parades under a sky heavy with radioactive particles. Postponing public ceremonies would have been an admission of the disaster's severity, the government's worst nightmare. It wasn't until years later that these decisions were exposed, adding yet another layer of distrust between the public and the state. If Gorbachev's Glasnost was beginning to pry open the truth, Chernobyl ripped the door off entirely. Inspired by Gorbachev's reforms, public movements in Eastern Europe began pushing openly for change. A critical factor in this unraveling was Gorbachev's deliberate decision to abandon the Brezhnev Doctrine. This policy, enacted after the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia, had justified the use of military force to maintain communist rule in Eastern Bloc nations. By renouncing that approach, Gorbachev signaled to Soviet satellite states that they would no longer face armed intervention if they pursued reform or change. It was a significant shift in Soviet foreign policy, but it also revealed Moscow's weakened grip on the region. Without the immediate threat of tanks rolling into their capitals, leaders and citizens alike began to take matters into their own hands. The revolutions began quietly, but quickly gathered momentum. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, which had operated underground for years, finally gained legal status. In June 1989, the first mostly free elections in decades took place, leading to a resounding victory for reformers. Meanwhile, in Hungary, a tide of change swept through legislation, border policies, and leadership. Hungary's decision to open its border with Austria set off a chain reaction as thousands of East Germans used the opportunity to escape to the West, creating a political crisis back in Berlin. East Germany, long a symbol of Soviet control in Europe, faced an unprecedented wave of protest. By November 1989, demonstrations had reached their peak, with hundreds of thousands taking to the streets, demanding freedom to travel and genuine reform. The pressure led to confusion inside the East German government. On the evening of November 9th, an unprepared official mistakenly announced the immediate opening of border crossings. Crowds surged to the Berlin Wall, which had stood for nearly 3 decades as a physical and ideological divider. In a matter of hours, the wall was breached. People from both sides celebrated, hammering at the concrete, symbolically and literally dismantling a system that had divided families and nations. Images of the Berlin Wall's collapse circled the globe, becoming an enduring symbol of the end of the Soviet era in Eastern Europe. Soon, other dominoes followed. The Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, named for its peaceful nature, overturned the communist government in weeks. In Bulgaria, sustained public demonstrations forced the resignation of its long-standing leader. Romania saw the most violent change. Nicolae Ceausescu, the fiercely oppressive dictator, was toppled by an armed uprising. He and his wife were captured and executed on Christmas Day in 1989. The televised trial and execution were a grim epilogue to the decades of harsh rule that Romanians had endured. For the Soviet Union, these upheavals were nothing short of a seismic loss. Eastern Europe had long been its buffer zone, a collection of states that represented not only ideological triumph, but also territorial security. Their sudden collapse was a testament to the fragile nature of Soviet control. The system had relied on the fear of intervention rather than genuine loyalty or buy-in from the population. Without that fear, the entire structure crumbled rapidly. The fall of the Eastern Bloc brought both triumph and turbulence. Nations could finally determine their own paths, but the road ahead presented significant challenges. Political systems were rebuilt almost overnight, leading to instability, while the transition to market economies created widespread hardships. People who had yearned for freedom found that achieving it was only the beginning of an uncertain new era. One enduring legacy of this change was the exposure of how deeply embedded surveillance and control had been. In East Germany, the infamous Stasi had gathered files on around 1/3 of the adult population. After the regime collapsed, citizens rushed to uncover or destroy these records, their contents revealing the suffocating extent of life under constant watch. In August 1991, the Soviet Union stood on the edge of collapse as a desperate group of hardline officials made one final attempt to preserve the old order. This group, known as the State Committee on the State of Emergency, was composed of high-ranking Soviet officials, including members of the KGB, the military, and Gorbachev's own government. They were fiercely opposed to the pace and scope of Gorbachev's reforms, particularly his concessions to democracy and his willingness to loosen Moscow's grip on the Soviet republics. Believing the Union could only be saved by force, they organized a coup to take control. The plot began with a dramatic move to isolate Gorbachev, who was vacationing at his dacha in Crimea. On August 18th, coup leaders placed him under house arrest, cutting off his communication with the outside world. Back in Moscow, they declared a state of emergency and announced that they had taken control, claiming they were acting on behalf of the people to restore order. Tanks and troops rolled into the capital, ostensibly to enforce this new emergency committee, as they shut down independent media outlets and attempted to secure major government institutions. Yet, despite their control of military resources, the coup leaders failed to present a united front and underestimated the resistance they would face. In a now iconic moment, Boris Yeltsin, the recently elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, emerged as the leading figure of the opposition. Refusing to recognize the authority of the coup leaders, Yeltsin positioned himself in front of the Russian Parliament building, known as the White House. Standing atop a tank, he delivered a call to action: defy the illegal seizure of power. His bold move rallied not only the public, but also key parts of the military, many of whom refused to carry out the orders of the plotters. Crowds of civilians gathered in the streets, forming human barricades around the parliament and confronting soldiers, making it clear that this was no longer just a political standoff, it was a battle for the future of the nation. The coup unraveled rapidly as cracks within the plotters' ranks became impossible to hide. While some elements of the military remained loyal, others hesitated, unwilling to fire on their own citizens or escalate the situation further. Their indecision allowed protests in Moscow and other cities to grow. Images of the events, including Yeltsin's tank address and civilian defiance in the streets, were broadcast live thanks to the openness introduced by Glasnost. The irony being that the very transparency the coup leaders sought to extinguish worked against them. Rather than suppress unrest, media coverage exposed their weakness and emboldened demonstrators. Within 3 days, the coup collapsed. Gorbachev was released from house arrest and flown back to Moscow, but the damage to his authority was irreversible. The Communist Party itself, deeply implicated in the plot, was banned in Russia by the end of the year. Meanwhile, Yeltsin emerged as the most powerful political figure in the country, symbolizing a shift in leadership that aligned more with the aspirations of democratic reformers. The failure of the coup ignited a chain reaction across the Soviet republics. Sensing the weakening grip of the central government, many republics moved decisively toward independence. In the months that followed, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, and others declared their sovereignty, effectively dismantling what remained of Soviet unity. Even within Russia, the mood had shifted. Yeltsin's popularity soared as the driving force behind resistance to the coup, giving him an upper hand against an increasingly sidelined Gorbachev. The broadcasted chaos of those 3 days made it clear to the world and to Soviet citizens that the system was beyond repair. The coup not only hastened the collapse of the USSR, but it also became a defining symbol of its unraveling. As tanks withdrew from Moscow and flags of independence began to fly across former Soviet republics, it marked the beginning of the end for a superpower whose ambitions once reshaped the world. In the aftermath of the failed coup in August 1991, the Soviet Union unraveled at a pace no one could have foreseen. The coup had shattered what little legitimacy the central government had left, and its failure created a sense of inevitability about the Soviet Union's collapse. Across the 15 republics of the USSR, the push for independence surged forward with unprecedented momentum. Ukraine, the second most powerful Soviet republic, declared independence just days after the coup. Belarus and the Baltic states, which had been fiercely resisting Soviet rule for decades, followed suit soon after. Each declaration weakened the Union further, and it quickly became clear that the tide could not be turned back. Mikhail Gorbachev, now politically marginalized, made a final attempt to salvage the Soviet Union through negotiation. He proposed a restructured federation, one that would allow more autonomy to the republics while maintaining a central Soviet government. But by this point, the republics were unwilling to settle for half measures. The concept of sovereignty had taken hold, and leaders across the former Soviet territories recognized that complete independence was within arm's reach. The idea of staying connected to Moscow, even under a looser framework, no longer appealed to them. Negotiations stagnated, and Gorbachev found himself isolated, unable to command enough authority to influence the process. The decisive blow came on December 8, 1991, when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a secluded hunting lodge in the forests of Belarus. Boris Yeltsin, the president of Russia, joined Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk and Belarusian leader Stanislav Shushkevich in signing the Brezhnev Accords. The remarkable agreement formally declared that the Soviet Union had ceased to exist and announced the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, as a successor entity. Notably, these three leaders bypassed Gorbachev entirely, further underscoring his diminished influence. For a country that less than a decade earlier had seemed like an unshakable superpower, the Soviet Union was now dissolving with astonishing speed and finality. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned as president of the Soviet Union. That same evening, the Soviet flag, a symbol of communist dominance and global ambition for nearly 70 years, was quietly lowered from the Kremlin and replaced by the Russian tricolor. It was a moment of profound symbolism, marking the official end of the USSR. Overnight, what had been one of the most formidable political entities in history was replaced by 15 independent nations, each facing its own challenges. Russia, as the largest and most powerful of the former republics, inherited the Soviet Union's United Nations seat, along with its nuclear arsenal. But it also inherited the weight of economic chaos, political instability, and a rapidly changing global role. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War, fundamentally reshaping the world's balance of power. For many, particularly in Eastern Europe and the Baltic states, it was a liberation, an opportunity to finally break free from Soviet domination and forge a new path of self-determination. But within Russia and other former Soviet states, reactions were mixed. While some celebrated newfound freedoms, others mourned the loss of a system that, despite its brutality, had provided structure and stability to millions of lives. People faced economic uncertainty, the fragmentation of industries, and the daunting task of redefining what it meant to be a nation. Amid the chaos of dissolution, a new and dangerous problem emerged: the massive stockpile of nuclear weapons scattered across former Soviet territory. More than 27,000 nuclear warheads were left behind, with Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan hosting significant arsenals. In the years that followed, global efforts focused on securing these weapons to prevent them from falling into the wrong hands, an issue that underscored the lingering risks of the Soviet Union's collapse. As the dust settled, the legacy of that collapse proved to be as complex as the history that had shaped it. The legacy of the Soviet Union is one of stark contradictions. It left an indelible mark on the 20th century, both as a symbol of industrial and scientific achievement and as a cautionary tale of the devastating cost of ideological extremism. For nearly 7 decades, the USSR redefined global politics, reshaping an agrarian Russian empire into a nuclear-armed superpower. Yet, this transformation came at an immense human cost. Through collectivization that led to famine, state-sponsored purges, widespread forced labor, and the systematic suppression of personal freedoms. Despite its collapse, the Soviet Union left behind contributions that continue to resonate across the world. In science and technology, it catalyzed advances that stunned even its rivals. Sputnik, launched in 1957, marked humanity's first step into space, igniting what we now know as the space race. Soviet engineers and cosmonauts consistently pushed the limits of exploration, from Yuri Gagarin becoming the first human in orbit to the development of Mir, the ambitious precursor to today's International Space Station. These achievements position the USSR as a scientific powerhouse, and they remain sources of pride in the former Soviet states, particularly in Russia. The USSR also established a comprehensive system of education that raised literacy rates across a land that once struggled with widespread illiteracy under the Tsar. Public campaigns emphasized universal schooling, and the arts, particularly music, ballet, and cinema, flourished under state sponsorship, even as they often served propagandistic purposes. Infrastructure projects like sprawling metro systems, exemplified by the elaborate stations of the Moscow metro, still capture attention for their grandeur and functionality. Yet these accomplishments existed alongside a repressive political apparatus that controlled nearly every aspect of daily life. One of the Soviet Union's most defining and controversial legacies is its governance model. It legitimized a one-party system that relied on mass surveillance, a cult of personality, and the suppression of dissent to maintain control. While its subsequent collapse promised a fresh start for its successor states, elements of this authoritarian governance have persisted, particularly in nations like Russia and Belarus. In Central Asia, former Soviet republics such as Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan inherited structures of centralized control that continue to limit democratic freedoms. The iron grip of the Soviet state may be gone, but many of its methods left lasting blueprints. Globally, the Cold War created a polarized world order, with the US and USSR as its anchors. Their rivalry defined foreign policy for nearly 50 years, sparking conflicts and proxy wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, and fueling an arms race that threatened human existence with nuclear annihilation. While the Soviet ideal of international socialism inspired movements around the globe, the reality of its implementation often alienated even potential allies. The Cold War's conclusion at the hands of the Soviet collapse shifted geopolitics permanently, ushering in a unipolar world dominated by the United States. Nostalgia for the Soviet period lingers in many parts of its former territory. For some, it represents an era of stability, guaranteed employment, and superpower status. In modern Russia, Vladimir Putin has selectively embraced symbols of the Soviet Union, not its Marxist-Leninist ideology, but its might, its influence, and its victories, such as the triumph in World War II. This calculated adoption of its past is used as a tool to unify Russia and project power, even as it avoids reflection on the darker chapters of Soviet history. Yet, across Eurasia, the crimes of the Stalinist period and the hardships of the Union's collapse remain raw. Monuments, museums, and public memorials serve as reminders of the Gulag system, the purges, and the human cost paid for rapid industrialization. Time may have softened some wounds, but the debate about the Soviet Union, its achievements, and its failures remains deeply divisive. Incredibly, the USSR was the longest-lasting communist state, surviving nearly 70 years. At its peak, it comprised 1/6 of the Earth's landmass, making it the largest country by area in human history. It was a nation built on ambition, but ultimately undone by its own contradictions. Its legacy remains a puzzle, a triumph of human ingenuity on one hand, and a sobering reminder of what unchecked power can cost on the other. The Soviet Union is gone, but its shadow still stretches across the globe. From ideology to industry, war to wonder, its impact is impossible to ignore. Want more epic stories like this? Subscribe now and let history blow your mind, one chapter at a time.